Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. Happy Pride Month, everybody. It's not only during Pride Month that we need to focus on the LGBTQ plus community, but it's certainly a good time to celebrate and reflect. And in this episode, we're going to do just that.
So, let's briefly talk about the environment when video games entered the world in the early 70s. The Stonewall riots of the 1969 marks an important moment in history internationally for the LGBTQ plus community. Just to recap a little bit about the Stonewall riots, so the Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in New York that was raided by police on June 28th, a commonplace occurrence, but this time it caused a response by the LGBT community that led to large protests. The riots were a pivotal moment for the gay liberation movement in the Western world and would eventually become annual celebrations in the form of marches, better known as Pride Parades. So, in the context of video games, when Pong hit the arcades in 1972, the gay liberation movement had barely just begun.
Yeah, during the earliest days of video games, games did definitely not understand, talk about, portray, let alone feature LGBTQ plus persons in video games. Similar to other popular culture media like movies and television, there was large heteronormativity present in video games, meaning that cisgendered heterosexual relationships were superior and normal compared to those that were not. As such, a number of offensive and negative stereotypes, tropes, and themes were found in video games in regards to LGBTQ plus people, especially during the start of video games. Most prominent tropes were 1. Bury your gays, also known as the dead lesbian syndrome, a convention where gay or lesbian characters tend to meet unhappy endings such as heartbreak, loss, insanity, depression, or imprisonment. And number 2, comical gender confusion, whereby homosexual characters would take on the stereotypes of the opposite gender, so gay characters would be turned into sissy characters with flamboyant mannerisms and speech, for example. Often characters were portrayed as antagonists and villains in games, and very often they were over-sexualized too. The earliest queer representation in video games can be found in the 1985 French mystery game Le Crime du Parking.
Is that about parking crime?
No, I think it's French for maybe someone called parking? I don't know. Paco is an example of one of the most fundamentally flawed tropes of LGBTQ plus representation in games, in that the gay character plays the antagonist, though I guess at least he wasn't only the main villain, he was also a dealer and a tailor. So he was slightly not one-dimensional, he was like 1.1 dimensional, I guess.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, yeah, but still not portrayed in positive manner, I guess.
No, not at all. Not at all.
But you know what, Player One, as much as the early history of LGBTQ plus representation in video games were quite hard to swallow, games were also used as means for good and progress. It's not always bad. Keeper in the Castor is a murder mystery slash puzzle solving game designed by CM Rolfe, a non binary transgender person, back in 1988. It is the first gay and lesbian themed computer game. CM Rolfe was inspired to make the video game in their private time after work. Having moved from Southern California to San Francisco's Bay Area, CM Rolfe and their partner were so moved by how welcoming the community was to them, especially compared to where they came from. So they wanted to give back to the community of the Bay Area and commemorate their friends that passed from the time's AIDS epidemic. The game was released in 1989 and distributed as charityware on gay bulletin boards, with a request to donate to an AIDS charity of the gamer's choosing. So you can basically get the game for free, but you're expected to make charity in return. So, talking about the game a little bit, in the game, you play as the world famous lesbian private detective, Tracker McDyke. You're searching for a kidnapped drag queen, Tessie LaFemme, but what you didn't count on was to stumble onto an even larger and more treacherous crime. You can actually still play the game online now, and we'll leave a link down in the description so you can enjoy it too. And the game is believed to have been downloaded around 250,000 times in 5 years, mostly in the US and Europe. But the exact stats were hard to gauge due to the nature of distributing the game. And actually, what's interesting, CM Ralph didn't even realize that they still have the copy of the game at that time.
Yeah, it was a classy situation of them having found it again, buried deep in all the tech stuff. Yeah, as is so common, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe like they found it when they were about to move house or something, and like, oh, I just realized I still have the original version of the game because at one point it was thought to be gone.
Lost,
Actually, yeah,
lost
to be
forever.
lost. Yeah,
But it's not, it's right here. Link in the description.
yes. So CM Ralph decided to quote unquote straighten up the game. Here's a quote from CM Ralph. I took Caper in the Castro and I made a copy of it. And then I went through it card by card by card and made it straight. I straightened it and I took all the gay references. I took out all the references to the Castro, all the inside jokes, everything, and I renamed it Murder on Main Street. I sold it to Hates's software and I mean, not a lot of money, but I made a steady income for many years from that program. It always cracked me up that these people were loving this game and buying it and had no idea it was actually an LGBT game.
In that quote, I believe CM Ralph is laughing a lot telling this story back, but obviously I don't think it's easy for us to laugh on his behalf
I know.
in the quote. But yeah, he's having a lot of fun telling us this story.
Yes. By the way, CM Rolf never actually worked professionally as a game designer, but he still made video game history. So, for this episode, we'll name CM Rolf as our video game history legend.
That's right. It's been a while since we've crowned someone video game history legends.
I know.
We need to do it more often. Well, sticking to 1988 though, let's again swallow that bitter pill to see how video games were doing representation wrong most of the time, like 99% of the time basically. You may remember Birdo from Super Mario Bros. 2, the pink mini-boss with the mouth cannon shooting X. She is one of the first, if not the first, trans character in a video game. The manual from the game describes Birdo as a boy who wants to be a girl and called Birdetta. Trans representation suffered from being often portrayed by villain characters, as we've already mentioned, but also mockery. It's supposed to be perceived as foolish and humiliating that Birdo wears a big bow and wants a woman's name. Birdo was given a deep male voice even in some of the Japanese commercials.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Incomprehensibly, a Japanese-only game was released for the Wii as late as 2008 called Captain Rainbow, which was developed by Skip Limited, but it was published by Nintendo. In the game, Birdo is imprisoned for entering a public female bathroom. The main character Nick frees Birdo by proving that Birdo is in fact a female. And how does he do this? Well, he does this by finding an object in her bed, which is covered with a question mark, but it's heavily implied to be an adult sexual toy for females. You couldn't make this up, could you really? Like, honestly, right?
I know. That's pretty crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite crazy Nintendo got away with this, especially since the games that they were allowed to have published on their consoles until 1994, when the ESRB rating system was created and replaced the need for Nintendo to enforce their own censorship rules. Providing that games were properly rated, limited what could be portrayed in their games, and yet still they don't seem to care too much about their own rules sometimes, huh? A game sold for a Nintendo system could neither display nor make reference to illicit drugs, tobacco and alcohol, violence against women, blood and graphic violence, profanity, nudity, religious symbols, political advocacy, or sexually suggestive or explicit content. And I failed to see how Birdo Burdetta doesn't fall into this sexually suggestive or explicit content, if I'm being quite frank.
Yeah, they probably got away with it because they blurred it and covered it with question mark. I'm not saying that the item itself is something that's wrong, but I guess the story itself, how it's not even allowing Birdo to be Burdetta or to be portrayed as female, and she has to be proven that she's female. That's just really, really wrong.
Well, them rules I read out. So that was what Nintendo was doing up until 94 in-house. Those were their own rules, right? And then the ESRB rating kind of replaced the need for Nintendo to do it themselves. The Captain Rainbow game, that was actually 2008. So they weren't stuck to their own rule set anymore.
Yep.
But I mean, it does come to show, I think, the general approach that Nintendo wants to take in terms of like family friendliness, I suppose, yeah. But then shoot themselves so badly in the foot at the same time. I think they got kind of lucky that they released this in Japan only, because I think this would have caused quite a stir in the rest of the Western world if this game came out in America and Europe as late as 2008, when our own sensibilities were, I think, already quite more progressive generally, I think, than they used to be in the 80s and 90s, right? When Capcom created beat 'em up classic Final Fight for the arcade, they approached Nintendo for a SNES version of the game. Nintendo would not allow two enemy characters to remain in the game, and they were called Roxy and Poison. Capcom told Nintendo that the characters were actually transsexual, so Nintendo's policy of no violence against women did not apply somehow.
I am baffled by this one.
The characters were nevertheless removed for the international versions of Final Fight for the SNES. Another example of Nintendo censoring and making changes to a game before release on their consoles was Dragon Warrior 3. In 1992, the developer Enix was made to remove a gay bar, among other things, from their game. And since we're talking about Nintendo, you might wonder Sega. Well, Sega, by the way, they had very similar guidelines and policies for the games that could be released on their consoles. However, they were somewhat more liberal. Sega still very often made sure that things were toned down where they felt it was appropriate to do so. And Nintendo's also come under fire in even more recent times when they released Tomodachi Life in 2013, a Nintendo 3DS sim-style game featuring the Mii avatar characters. In the game, same-sex marriage was impossible. Nintendo did apologize for this, however, at least, and promised if a sequel were to ever be made, they would strive to be more inclusive. Apparently they went as far as to say like, oh, because of the game's code, it's too big of something that we can just patch over. We'll put it in the sequel if there ever is one.
Well, have they made a sequel then?
No, of course not. Nobody likes some little Mii avatars, do they really?
No, I guess not. Okay, fair point. But they should stick to their words.
Yeah, right.
Hopefully.
We'll see.
So, entering the 90s, in the 90s, games still often continued to use stereotypical LGBT characters that did not reflect the diversity in the community. However, efforts were made to make more diverse, less one-dimensional characters, or 1.1, as Paco before.
Yeah, well, it's gonna be almost two-dimensional now.
Yeah,
Woohoo.
probably. So Namco's 1992 Game Boy RPG game called Great Greed allow you to marry one of the characters in the game, so you're playing as a male main character. So you can choose to marry any of the characters in the game, including the king himself. So I guess there is a king and also the daughters. Am I right, JP?
Yeah, so at the end of the game, the very end of the game, you get to choose who you want to marry. So you can marry all of the king's daughters, apart from one, which was underage. But you could also marry the king himself, and you being a male character, yeah, that would mean it's an early example of same-sex marriage in video games.
Yeah. Another one is Circuit's Age from 1990 for DMS-DOS. It was a cyberpunk point-and-click game that included two characters, Said is a homosexual friend to Marit, the game's protagonist, and Marit's ex girlfriend, Yasmin, is a trans woman. If it hadn't been for Birdo and Super Mario Bros. 2, released months earlier, Yasmin would have likely been gaming's first trans person. Though only being a side role, at least she wasn't stereotyped or mocked in that sense.
No, it was normal in the context of the game. Like, yeah, Marit has an ex-girlfriend. She is a trans woman, and that's
Yeah.
kind of like the end of it. You know what I mean? It's not, celebrated, mocked. To be honest, is a little bit backstory. Even I don't think she's like a main character in the game. It's
Mhm.
it just it's a little bit, I guess, backstory to him.
Progress is progress, though.
Yeah, at least it's normal. Like it's portrayed as this is a normal thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but still, it wasn't all positive and progressive, though. Dracula Unleashed for the PC from 1993 featured Alfred Horner, the first openly gay character in a game with a speaking part. However, his character was again plagued by over sexualization, acting incredibly perverse and lusting for the main character. So, digging more into the 90s, in Phantasmagoria 2, A Puzzle of Flesh, PC point and click horror game from back in 1996, is actually one of the first games we are able to play as an openly non heterosexual main character named Curtis. This might sound quite positive at first, but it's worth mentioning that the game used this as somewhat means to make player feel very uncomfortable. The game is very psychological in that sense. So it was a controversial horror game at the time of release, and Curtis is told by a psychiatrist that he may be a bisexual, alluding it as something that's quite negative and uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. The game uses this as a way of making the player feel uncomfortable, including the tone, the acting of the characters and stuff. So it's definitely not a positive thing, unfortunately. However, it is still a game where we get to play as an openly non-heterosexual main character.
Yeah. So Fallout 2 from 1998 was totally chill though with same-sex relationship, and probably that's why we love the franchise so much.
I mean, it's one of the reasons we like the franchise so much.
Yeah,
Definitely.
definitely. But yeah, and if you haven't watched the TV show, by the way, please do it.
Please do it.
It's a great one.
It's so good.
It's
Okay.
so good.
Okay, stop being a fanboy and girl now. Let's move on.
But yeah, moving on to the 2000s, we see a lot more positive things coming from mainstream video games regarding LGBTQ plus representation.
So, whilst Maxis was working on developing the first Sims game, there was an early discussion of whether or not to allow queer relationships in the game. And initially, the decision was made not to. One programmer, however, who joined the party late, didn't seem to get the memo
Oh
and
god.
programmed the possibility in anyway.
Good job.
When E3 happened in 1999, and rest in peace by the way, E3, a demo of the game was shown, which showcased two Sims getting married. During the demo, two female Sims fell in love and kissed passionately in front of the whole crowd. Thanks to this, The Sims became a sensation and were the big talk of E3 that year. It was decided that queer relationships will stay in the game. As Bob Ross would say, there are no mistakes, only happy accidents.
100%.
Knights of the Old Republic is a 2003 Star Wars RPG game. Juhani, one of the party members, is an openly lesbian character and the first LGBT character in the entire Star Wars universe.
We'd like to take a moment actually to thank Player One Ashley for pointing out that Celeste from 2018 is a beloved game for the transgender community. So, in the game's final chapter, Chapter 9, called Farewell, Madeline has a video call with Theo. Beneath her computer screen, two small pride and transgender flags can be seen. An old photo appears of Madeline as a child with shorter hair, which fans of the game believed were pictures of her before transition. Next to Madeline's bed are bottles of pills, which could be thought of as medicine for depression and anxiety she faces in the game, or perhaps hormone therapy? Much of this was fan speculation at first, but developer Matty Thorson has confirmed the fan theories. So, thank you, Ashley, for contacting us and pointing that out after you heard us talking about Celeste on our neurodiversity episode.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. I mean, we are the Gaming History Club, but that's not just me and Gabby. It is definitely you as well, Player One. You are in this club, and we are extremely excited whenever anyone sends us a message. So let it be known, you got anything you want to say, you want anything added, come reach out to us.
Yeah, 100%. So, before we wrap up this episode, let's discuss this very interesting research made by GLAAD, an American nonprofit organization formed back in 1985 with the intent to fight defamatory language against the LGBTQ plus community in the media. So, the research is called The State of LGBTQ Inclusion in Video Games. We will link the full research report down in the description. It's a really interesting read, so by all means, Player One, do read at your leisure. The report says that it was created to educate the game industry on the current state of LGBTQ representation that exists, make fact based business case for LGBTQ inclusion, and provide a playbook for more authentic representation. We got a lot of stats from this report. JP, you want to hit us with some cool facts?
Let's see here. 17% of active gamers, which makes nearly 1 in 5, identify as LGBTQ. When this research was conducted in 2023. This was an increase from 10% back in 2020, so 7% increase in just a matter of 3 years, yeah? However, games with LGBTQ characters or storylines account for less than 2% of all games, just showing how bad gaming actually is with proper representation of their gamers.
So, Glut basically did the research together with Nielsen, a research company. So, Nielsen found that LGBTQ or not, they spend similar amount of money in games. But 70% of LGBTQ plus gamers indicate that they will less likely buying from a studio with a history of mistreating LGBTQ plus workers.
LGBTQ gamers are more likely to play Nintendo Switch, although they have the lowest percentage of available games that contain LGBTQ plus characters or storylines. And I'm quite surprised too, after having, pointed out Nintendo's failings in the past and more recent present, to be fair. But the explanation might be more towards the lower cost of entry for the Nintendo Switch, because the study also shows that LGBTQ plus gamers have relatively lower incomes than non-LGBTQ plus gamers. This is something that they do want to research more in future as well to find out, well, why is that actually, yeah? But yeah, quite surprising. And remember when we talked about representation matters in our Who Plays Video Games episode? This research proves it again. 72% of LGBTQ plus gamers say that seeing characters with their identity or sexual orientation that is well represented, of course, makes them feel better about themselves. Yeah, no surprise there at all whatsoever. I mean, it does always sound so obvious, but, it's only once you put it in text where you actually, I think, internalize it, and no such thing as common sense, right? But yeah, of course, they want to see themselves represented well in games, and they should.
Yeah, I mean, even more so, it's not only LGBTQ plus gamers who seek more prominent LGBTQ plus storylines in games. 1 in 5 non-LGBTQ plus gamers also want this. So, there is this stigma where game developers feel that it won't be accepted as much when they're making it solely for LGBTQ plus representation. No, no, no. It's fine. Good games are good games. That's kind of the bottom line here.
60% of non-LGBTQ plus gamers said it won't bother their decision to buy the game or not when it comes to having a main character who's gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. It's clear to see from the data that even non-LGBTQ plus gamers are more open to playing games with LGBTQ plus content than the industry might assume.
So I know that this research is very US biased, but did you know that in 2023, the Equality Federation has tracked over 500 anti-LGBTQ plus bills across US? Majority of those targeting transgender community, primarily youth. That's over 250 than the year before, and it's been record-breaking every year since 2021.
Although most of the bills didn't become law, game developers need to understand how important their role is for LGBTQ plus gamers. Gaming is necessary to cope with real-world discrimination and targeting. In these particular states where the bills were submitted, 65% of LGBTQ plus gamers note that they depend on video games to get them through tough times, and 75% say that video games allow them to express themselves in a way they don't feel comfortable doing it in the real world. This also very much reminds me of our accessibility episode, yeah?
Yeah,
Video games are such a lifeline for people, yeah? It's very, very important for many people.
yeah, definitely.
So, Player One, thank you for joining us on this colorful episode of LGBTQ plus history in video games. We sincerely hope you've enjoyed this episode.
Yes, so let us know your perspective of the state of representation in video games nowadays. And if you know any cool games that you want to suggest to us, drop us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. New episodes of Gaming History Club are released every second Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
Come back in a couple of weeks, Player One, when we find out just how intelligent artificial intelligence is in video games. See ya.